Welcome to Training 1, Module 1, Introduction to the Copper Mark Assurance Process. This training is intended for users of the assurance process, including copper producer practitioners and copper mark assessors. This module covers an introduction to the copper mark and an introduction to the copper mark assurance process. The Copper Mark is the first and only assurance framework for copper, created to demonstrate responsible production practices and the industry's contribution to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. With the Copper Mark, we work to improve the lives of colleagues and neighbors and strengthen the communities in which the copper industry does business. Founded and developed by the International Copper Association, the Copper Mark is an independent organization since December 2019, governed by its board of directors and multi-stakeholder advisory council. Its development included extensive consultation and involvement of over 80 external stakeholders, including NGOs, CSOs, end-user companies, investors, market regulators, and other regulatory agencies. The Copper Mark adopted the Risk Readiness Assessment, or RRA, created by the Responsible Minerals Initiative, rather than creating a new responsible production standard. The RRA is comprised of 32 environmental, social, and governance issue areas associated with sourcing minerals and metals. For each issue, the criteria specify the management practice known as the industry norm. The industry norm is derived from a comparative analysis of the requirements of approximately 50 voluntary sustainability standards that are commonly used in the minerals and metals supply chains and representative of good management practices. The criteria are discussed in more detail in Module 3. The Copper Mark achieves its objectives through a framework based on these principles: pragmatic, inclusive, recognition-based, progressive, and continuous and systematic monitoring. The Copper Mark goes beyond compliance and requires the continuous improvement of production practices. It takes a comprehensive approach and covers all major environmental, social, and governance issue areas. During this first phase, participants in the Copper Mark are called copper producers. Copper producers can only participate in the Copper Mark if they commit to completing the assurance process. The program is site-based and requires that production practices at the site are verified through an independent third-party assessment. Copper producers are entities with an operating mining site or facility with solvent extraction and electrowinning, smelting, or refining operations that are located in one geographic area and are operated under one management system. To be eligible to participate in the Copper Mark, producers must produce copper or copper products. Other entities in the copper value chain can join the Copper Mark as partners. Copper Mark partners are companies in the copper value chain that publicly commit to the Copper Mark's vision and objectives and recognize responsible copper production and sourcing in their business activities through expressing a preference for copper producers assured by the Copper Mark. Stakeholders that are not part of the copper value chain, for example, assessors, NGOs, or community organizations, can support the Copper Mark and engage through the community of practice, working group, and leadership positions within the organization. The Copper Mark assurance process was designed with the participation of the copper industry and other stakeholders. In this way, it implements a comprehensive assurance process that balances practical implementation with credibility and international best practice. The Copper Mark was designed to be efficient and flexible enough that copper producers can leverage existing systems to demonstrate responsible production. Thus, the Copper Mark recognizes externally assured systems that are materially comparable in scope and intent to the Copper Mark. This is documented in the Copper Mark's recognition process and discussed in more detail in Module 2 of this training series. For now, note that the copper producer may submit external assurances or certifications that cover one or more of the RRA criteria for review, and to do so before completing the self-assessment. The 5 steps of the assurance process and associated timelines are individually covered throughout the training modules. Broadly, the 5 steps are: Step 1, sign a letter of commitment. This is the copper producer's public statement to complete the steps of the assurance process in accordance with the defined timelines. Step 2, complete a self-assessment against the RRA criteria in the online RRA platform within 6 months of signing the letter of commitment. In this step, the copper producer prepares for the site assessment by reviewing the site's current practices, categorizing systems and certificates for equivalence, and identifying any areas for improvement. Step 3, independent review of the self-assessment and site-level on-site assessment. Here, an independent reviewer looks at the information submitted by the copper producer as well as publicly available information. The purpose of this review is for the copper mark to understand the context in which the copper producer operates. The review is finalized within 1 month of completing the self-assessment. The independent reviewer then provides the copper mark with a recommendation for and the scope of the site assessment. A site assessment is always required and may be completed either through equivalency, the assurance process, or an add-on assessment. During the site assessment, copper mark approved assessors appointed by the copper producer checks the status of the site's performance against the RRA criteria. In step 4, identify gaps and complete an improvement plan. If there are any gaps identified during the site assessment by the copper mark assessor, the copper producer develops a plan to close those within a maximum of 24 months from signing the letter of commitment. The assessor reviews the plan and later verifies its implementation to assure that the copper producer is fully aligned on all criteria. Step 5, maintain regular assessments. The copper producer undergoes a reassessment every 3 years or when there are significant operational changes or incidents. The copper mark assurance process is currently available for copper producers. Such entities might produce other metals as well as copper. Included in the copper supply chain are multi-metal producers that produce gold, nickel, lead, molybdenum, and zinc alongside copper. Because the program is site-based, all metals produced at the site can be included in the scope of the assessment. A site may comprise several activities, for example, mines, wastewater treatment facilities, refineries, and sometimes ports and associated infrastructure. These may be in different locations, but in the same geographic area. When these activities are under the same management control, they are considered one copper production site and are assessed together. Activities that take place in different geographic locations or are under multiple management systems are assessed separately. In the case of corporate level policies, the assurance process assesses implementation of those policies at the site level. The Copper Mark core documents are available on the Copper Mark website in English, Spanish, and Chinese. The Copper Mark assurance process outlines the process steps, deadlines, and defines the roles and responsibilities. The Copper Mark Criteria Guide provides more detailed guidance on the 32 issue areas, including an explanation of the requirement, description of the performance determination, and the means of verification. The Copper Mark Claims Guide outlines the requirements for use of the Copper Mark claims, including the types of claims, examples of permissible and impermissible use. The RRA Copper Mark Equivalency Matrix outlines which other sustainability systems, good practice frameworks, certifications, and externally assured management systems are already considered equivalent by the Copper Mark and which criteria they cover. 4 principal entities participate in the Copper Mark assurance process, each with its own roles and responsibilities. This training focuses on copper producers and Copper Mark assessors. Copper producers are the participants in the assurance process. They are contractually responsible for following the processes and timelines outlined in the assurance process and related documents. Let's take a quick look at the rules in each of the 5 steps. In step 1, the copper producer signs a letter of commitment. Copper producers should reserve ample time to review the producer agreement and letter of commitment with the appropriate internal teams. In step 2, the copper producer completes a self-assessment in the RRA platform. Copper producers should discuss any certificates or equivalent standards ahead of this step with the Copper Mark. A login to the platform will be sent directly from the platform, or it can be obtained through the Copper Mark. In step 3, the copper producer will first partake in the iterative review process with the independent reviewer assigned by the Copper Mark. Next, the copper producer will select the on-site assessor from a pool of Copper Mark approved assessors. The copper producer must communicate the date and assessor name to the Copper Mark well before the assessment takes place to ensure the individual or team is approved for all areas and scope of the assessment, the type of operations assessed, and the geography. In step 4, the copper producer will provide an improvement plan to the assessor. After implementing the improvement plan, the copper producer must work with the assessor to schedule an assessment of its implementation. In step 5, the copper producer should work with the Copper Mark to schedule the next full assessment. The copper producer must also inform the Copper Mark of any significant operational changes, as well as keep the Copper Mark informed of updates to equivalent systems or certifications. Assessors are experienced professionals and subject matter experts approved by the Copper Mark to carry out assessment activities. The assessor provides external validation to the copper producer by completing on-site visits to evaluate production practices against the RRA criteria based on the scope defined by the Copper Mark. Working independently or on a team, the assessor provides the Copper Mark with a summary report, the detailed assessment report, improvement plan where applicable, and recommendations for sites to be awarded the Copper Mark. The Copper Mark monitors the quality of the assessors as well as oversees their approval. As an assurance process, not a certification body, the Copper Mark does not issue a certificate. Successful completion of the assurance process results in the award of the Copper Mark to the participating site of the copper producer. This allows copper producers to make public statements about their association with the Copper Mark and the results of their assessment. The Copper Mark Claims Guide provides detailed guidance on use and will be discussed further in Training 3. This brings us to the end of Module 1. Thank you for your participation.